April 1861. No one in America believes this will be a long war. Crowds gather, bands play, young men enlist, convinced they will be home by Christmas. Politicians call it a necessary show of force. Newspapers promise a quick victory. But beneath the cheers, something far more dangerous is unfolding. For decades, the nation has been tearing itself apart, slowly, legally, and bitterly, over one question it never truly answered. Can a country founded on liberty survive while allowing slavery to exist? When Confederate guns open fire on Fort Sumter, the argument finally turns into violence. What begins as a political crisis becomes a test of survival, a test of whether the United States can remain one nation or whether it will shatter into two. Over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans will die. Cities will burn, families will be torn apart, and the meaning of freedom itself will be rewritten in blood. This is not just a story of battles and generals. This is the story of how America fought itself and was changed forever. This is the American Civil War. Two nations at war. As the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter, the United States was no longer a single nation united by law and tradition. It had split into two nations, each claiming legitimacy, each preparing for war. In the South, 7 states had seceded from the Union. They convened in Montgomery, Alabama, and formally created the Confederate States of America. To lead this new nation, they elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as president. Davis embodied the Confederacy's belief in state sovereignty, independence, and the protection of slavery as a legal and economic institution. Meanwhile, the Union remained determined to preserve the United States at all costs. President Abraham Lincoln and his administration viewed secession as illegal, a direct challenge to the Constitution. To them, allowing states to leave freely would destroy the very idea of a permanent nation. From the start, the two sides faced very different advantages and disadvantages. The Union commanded a larger population, a more extensive industrial base, and a strong navy capable of enforcing blockades and controlling rivers. The South, by contrast, relied on its military tradition, experienced officers, and the belief that defending home territory would give them a decisive edge. As both nations mobilized, men rushed to enlist. State militias, volunteer regiments, and newly formed armies began training, equipping, and organizing for the conflict ahead. Every strategy, every supply line, and every decision now had life or death consequences, not just for soldiers on the battlefield, but for the survival of each nation's ideals. In that moment, the United States ceased to be a single country in practice. Two nations stood ready to fight over the same land, the same principles, and the same future. The stage was set for a war unlike any America had ever seen, a war that would test the limits of endurance, leadership, and the very definition of freedom. The war begins. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, the fragile peace finally collapses. Confederate forces open fire on Fort Sumter, a United States military fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort is surrounded, undersupplied, and isolated, a symbol of federal authority in a state that has already declared its independence. For more than 30 hours, cannons thunder across the harbor. No soldiers are killed during the bombardment. Yet in that moment, the argument over America's future turns into open war. When Fort Sumter surrenders, the meaning is unmistakable. The Union has been challenged. The Confederacy has chosen force. News of the attack spreads rapidly across the country. In the North, the reaction is immediate. President Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he describes as an armed rebellion. Men rush to enlist. Public squares fill with patriotic speeches and rallies. There is widespread belief that the conflict will be short. Many soldiers sign up for only 90 days, convinced the fighting will be over before the year ends. In the South, confidence is just as strong. Confederate leaders believe their cause is defensive and righteous. They expect that Northern resolve will weaken once the true cost of war becomes clear. Neither side anticipates the scale of the struggle ahead. As Lincoln's call for troops spreads, it forces undecided states to choose. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina leave the Union rather than fight fellow Southern states. Their decision dramatically expands the Confederacy and brings the war dangerously close to the nation's capital. Families divide overnight. Friends find themselves on opposite sides. The nation fractures along lines that had been forming for generations. What begins at Fort Sumter is not simply a military clash. It is the opening moment of a war that will test whether the United States can survive at all. Strategies that shaped the conflict. When war erupted, both the Union and the Confederacy realized quickly that victory would not come from bravery alone. Strategy, resources, and leadership would decide who would prevail. The Union adopted what came to be known as the Anaconda Plan, designed to slowly suffocate the Confederacy. Its goal was clear: block Southern ports to cut off trade, seize control of the Mississippi River to divide the South, and gradually weaken its ability to sustain the war. It was a plan built on patience, aiming to win not with sudden force, but by wearing down the enemy over time. The Confederacy, on the other hand, relied on a defensive strategy. With fewer resources and a smaller industrial base, their aim was to protect their territory and outlast the North. Southern generals carefully chose when and where to fight, using their knowledge of the land to counter the Union's numerical advantage, hoping that prolonged resistance would erode Northern willpower. Infrastructure and logistics became as critical as the battlefield itself. The North's extensive railroads, rivers, and industrial capacity allowed armies to move quickly, transport supplies, and maintain a steady flow of weapons and provisions. The South, with its limited rail networks and dependence on agriculture, faced challenges in sustaining large armies, making control of key rivers and supply lines a constant concern. Leadership would define the course of the war. In the East, George B. McClellan trained the Union Army into a disciplined force, but often hesitated to act decisively in battle. Robert E. Lee, leading the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, displayed brilliant tactics, winning crucial early battles even while outnumbered. Meanwhile, Ulysses S. Grant in the West embraced relentless aggression, showing that sustained pressure and determination could eventually overcome Southern defenses. The Union also relied heavily on its naval power. A widespread blockade of Southern ports cut off access to international trade and crippled the Confederacy's economy. The South attempted to leverage its cotton exports to gain foreign support, but European powers largely refused to intervene. Economic pressure, along with blockades, would prove as important as any battle fought on land. Together, these strategies set the stage for a war that would be long, costly, and devastating. Victory would not come from a single battle or hero. It would be the result of careful planning, leadership, and the ability to leverage every resource available: industrial, human, and strategic. The war expands. By 1862, the Civil War had transformed from a short, expected conflict into a brutal and grinding struggle. The armies of both sides clashed across rivers, fields, and towns, and the true cost of the war became painfully clear. In the spring of 1862, the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee shocked both the Union and the Confederacy. Over 2 days of fierce fighting, more than 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The scale of the carnage shattered any lingering illusions that the war would be quick or easy. Later that year, in September, the Battle of Antietam in Maryland would mark another turning point. With over 22,000 casualties in a single day, it became the bloodiest single day in American history. The sight of shattered fields and exhausted soldiers made it clear that this war would demand sacrifices far beyond what anyone had imagined. In the East, the fighting reached a stubborn stalemate. Armies confronted each other repeatedly, each side probing for weaknesses, yet neither able to deliver a decisive blow. Generals learned that courage alone could not win battles. Strategy, resources, and timing were equally critical. The growing number of casualties began to affect the home front. News of deaths and injuries traveled slowly but surely, leaving families anxious and towns in mourning. Letters from soldiers described not only combat, but hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Public patience began to wane as the war dragged on, and support for both sides faced increasing strain. For civilians, the war was no longer distant. Homes and farms near battlefields were destroyed, supply lines were disrupted, and refugees moved wherever they could find safety. In some regions, families were forced to choose between loyalty to their states and survival. By the end of 1862, it was clear. The Civil War had expanded far beyond a series of battles. It had become a national crisis, touching every aspect of life and demanding that both the Union and the Confederacy prepare for a conflict far longer and bloodier than anyone had imagined. Emancipation changes the war. As the war dragged into its second year, President Abraham Lincoln faced a growing reality. The conflict could not be won by preserving the Union alone. Slavery, the institution at the heart of the nation's division, could no longer remain untouched. At the beginning of the war, Lincoln had been cautious. His primary goal was to keep the Union together, not to immediately abolish slavery. He feared that moving too quickly might push the border states into secession and weaken Northern support. But as casualties mounted and victory remained uncertain, Lincoln began to see emancipation not just as a moral cause, but as a military necessity. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in states still in rebellion were forever free. While it did not end slavery everywhere, it fundamentally transformed the nature of the war. The conflict was no longer solely about preserving the Union. It had become a fight against slavery itself. This shift carried powerful consequences. For enslaved African Americans, the proclamation offered hope and a clear path toward freedom. Thousands escaped plantations and made their way to Union lines, seeking safety and opportunity. Soon, African American men were allowed to enlist in the Union Army and Navy, forming units such as the United States Colored Troops. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black soldiers had served, providing manpower the Union desperately needed and proving their courage on the battlefield. The Emancipation Proclamation also reshaped the war's global meaning. European nations, particularly Britain and France, had considered recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. But once the war became openly linked to the abolition of slavery, foreign governments found it politically and morally difficult to side with the slave-holding nation. As a result, the Confederacy remained diplomatically isolated. Emancipation changed everything. It gave the Union a moral purpose, weakened the Southern economy, strengthened Northern armies, and redefined the stakes of the conflict. The Civil War was no longer just a struggle over territory or sovereignty. It had become a defining battle over the future of freedom in America. Total war and the cost of civilians. By 1864, the Civil War entered its most destructive phase. The Union, determined to end the conflict, adopted a new approach, one that targeted not only enemy armies, but the resources and morale that sustained them. At the center of this shift was Ulysses S. Grant. After a series of hard-fought victories in the West, Grant rose rapidly through the ranks and was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Unlike many before him, Grant understood that victory would come only through constant pressure. He was willing to accept heavy losses if it meant wearing down the Confederate forces, whose manpower and supplies were far more limited. In the East, Grant confronted Robert E. Lee directly, refusing to retreat after costly battles. At the same time, in the South, another Union general carried out a campaign that would redefine modern warfare. William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea became the most visible symbol of total war. As Sherman's army moved from Atlanta to Savannah, it destroyed railroads, factories, farms, and supply depots along the way. The goal was clear: to break the Confederacy's ability and will to continue fighting. This strategy devastated the Southern economy. Transportation networks collapsed, food became scarce, and inflation spiraled out of control. Plantations and towns that had once supported the war effort were left in ruins. Without railroads or reliable supply lines, Confederate armies struggled to survive. For civilians, the cost was immense. Families lost homes, livelihoods, and access to basic necessities. Women, children, and the elderly endured shortages of food, clothing, and medicine. Refugees fled advancing armies, often with nowhere to go. The war that had begun as a clash of armies now invaded kitchens, farms, and city streets. By late 1864, the Confederacy was exhausted, militarily, economically, and emotionally. Grant and Sherman's strategy made one truth unavoidable: the war could not continue much longer without complete collapse. The Civil War was no longer just being fought on battlefields. It was being felt in every household, and its end was drawing near, at a terrible cost to those caught in its path. Collapse of the Confederacy. By 1865, the Confederacy stood on the edge of collapse. Years of relentless fighting, economic destruction, and mounting losses had drained the South's ability to continue the war. What remained was a desperate struggle to survive against overwhelming odds. Outside the Confederate capital, Union forces tightened their grip during the siege of Petersburg. For nearly 10 months, General Ulysses S. Grant applied constant pressure, stretching Confederate defenses thinner with each passing week. Supplies ran dangerously low, and Confederate soldiers endured hunger, exhaustion, and declining morale. Petersburg was the final lifeline protecting Richmond, and once it faltered, the capital itself would fall. In April 1865, the Union finally broke through. With Petersburg lost, General Robert E. Lee had no choice but to abandon Richmond. As Confederate leaders fled, fires spread through the city, and Union troops soon entered the long-defended capital. The symbolic heart of the Confederacy had fallen. Lee attempted one last retreat westward, hoping to regroup and secure supplies. But Union forces moved faster, cutting off escape routes and surrounding his shrinking army. Weakened by starvation and desertion, Lee's men could no longer fight their way out. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee met Grant to discuss surrender. The terms were generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home, keep their personal belongings, and take their horses to plant crops. Grant understood that reconciliation, not revenge, was essential for the nation's survival. With Lee's surrender, organized Confederate resistance effectively ended. Other Southern armies soon laid down their arms, one by one. In April 1865, after 4 years of devastating conflict, the Civil War officially came to an end. The Union was preserved, slavery was destroyed, but the peace that followed would prove fragile, and the wounds left behind would shape America for generations to come. The human cost and the nation transformed. When the guns finally fell silent, the scale of the Civil War's devastation became impossible to ignore. More than 600,000 Americans were dead. Soldiers from both sides, many buried far from home, many never identified at all. It was the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, and nearly every family felt its reach. Entire towns lay in ruins. Farms were abandoned, railroads destroyed, and cities scarred by years of occupation and fighting. Widows and orphans filled communities across North and South, while wounded veterans returned home carrying physical injuries and invisible trauma that would last a lifetime. Yet from this destruction came a transformation unlike any America had known before. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment, slavery was permanently abolished. What generations had argued over and fought over was now written into the Constitution itself. Freedom, at least in law, was no longer negotiable. The Union had survived. The United States remained one nation, indivisible, but it emerged deeply scarred, politically, economically, and emotionally. Victory did not bring easy healing. The question now facing the country was no longer how to win the war, but how to live with its consequences. How would the South be rebuilt? What would freedom truly mean for millions of formerly enslaved people? And could a nation so violently divided ever become whole again? The Civil War had ended, but the struggle to define America's future was only just beginning. Victory without peace. The war was over. The fighting had stopped. But peace did not automatically follow. The Union had been preserved, yet national unity had not been restored. The bonds that once held the country together remained fragile, strained by grief, loss, and deep mistrust. For millions of formerly enslaved people, freedom arrived without certainty. They were no longer owned, but they were not yet protected. The question of what freedom truly meant and how it would be defended remained unanswered. In the South, defeat bred resentment. Cities lay in ruins, economies had collapsed, and bitterness simmered beneath the surface. Many white Southerners accepted the end of the war, but not the changes it had brought. America now faced a challenge greater than the war itself. Not how to fight, but how to heal. Not how to preserve the nation, but how to rebuild it. The Civil War had destroyed the old America in order to save it. What followed would determine whether the country could become something stronger or fracture all over again. That question would define the next era. Reconstruction had begun. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.